So let's continue our work on this application. But before we do so, I want to dive into some important concepts or some theory about React, which you also have to understand. We have two main types of components in React. We have presentational components and we have stateful components, you could say. Or put in other words, we have some components which are relatively dumb, which just output some content, apply some styling, some structure. And then we have components which also are smarter and manage some state and orchestrate that their child components receive new data and so on. The card component, which I provided to you, for example, is a good example for a presentational, for a dumb component. It just renders a div, it applies some styles, and it just outputs content it receives from outside through props. The same for the avatar. Also, very simple. User item, it's the same. It's really dumb. It has more HTML elements in there, but it only outputs content. It gets data from outside and renders that. It has this link, which has some built-in logic to block interaction and to block navigation, but that's handled by a third-party library, by another component actually, by the link component. The user item component, therefore, is pretty straightforward, only a presentational component. Same for the users list. It has the logic to decide what it renders, so it's maybe a bit smarter, but in the end it still only outputs something on the screen. The users component also is pretty dumb at this point, though theoretically the list of users here would be fetched from a backend. So whilst this component is dumb because we have to work with some dummy data, this would actually not be a pure presentational component. Instead, later in this course, this will be a component that does more than just present. It will be a component that will actively also fetch the data it wants to show. Here, again, we just don't have any backend from which we could fetch at this point. But this will later be not a dumb presentational component. Instead, later, this will be a stateful component, which indeed does fetch data. Now, what does this difference mean for you? How does this impact the way you build your components? Well, it's not really impacting the way you build your components. It's just important to be aware that there are these two types of components in React, smart and dumb ones, stateful and presentational ones. And it shouldn't impact how you build your components, but you should be aware of the fact that it's totally normal to have way more presentational components, dumb components, than stateful components. Typically, you have a few components where you manage your data, where you fetch data, and so on. And then you have way more components that simply control how things are presented and how things are laid out. That's just some theory about React and about components that you can keep in your mind, can be helpful in job interviews. And even if you're not looking for those, it's helpful knowledge to have if you are a React developer.